Well, good morning everybody and welcome back to the channel. And I've got to tell you, it's really good to be back out again with the camera after doing so many van build videos. Anyway, today, where are we? Well, today's really inspired by a workshop that I ran for a fantastic lady a couple of weeks ago. It was a one-to-one workshop. One of the things she wanted to cover was photographing water. And quite often when I do other workshops or when I do lectures for camera clubs, I get asked about photographing water all the time. And the thing that's asked most often is, how do I select my shutter speeds? So to answer that question, I've come today to a beautiful river. It's a little bit different than my normal sort of locations. I'm not even sure if it's inside the Dartmoor National Park. It might be a little bit outside of it. But let's crack on, see what we can find, because I know that there's just a fantastic composition waiting for us somewhere around the corner. I actually moved a few feet and changed my composition quite a bit. There was a rock in the bottom corner just down here. I don't know if you can see it on the viewfinder video I'm doing, that was really pointing out into the frame, and it was taking far too much of that frame up and being really dominant in the image. I just didn't like it. It upset the balance. It made it too heavy on the left hand side. So the first thing that I've done when I'm thinking about photographing water is obviously what's important to me in the frame. Is it the depth of field? Is it the aperture? Is it the speed that the water's moving and how much blur that I want? And that's the thing that people talk about most of the time, is how blurred that water's going to be. The problem is, like all types of photography, that blurred water is a combination of a number of different elements. It's not just one thing which controls it. It's the speed of the water itself, the amount of the water, and how we control that exposure changes the amount of blur that we get. I think I've said it before on this channel that photography is all about compromise, and you can never have the perfect aperture, the perfect shutter speed, the perfect ISO setting, the perfect lighting conditions. What you have to do is work with them, work with what you've got. And I think that's the first learning point that I want you to take away from shooting water, is think about what's important for you in the picture and what you want to bring in. So in this image, what was important to me? Well, what was important was, one, the composition. I've already mentioned about that. I wanted to have this small waterfall, which I'm showing you, contained within these rocks. These greens are glowing and looking really quite good, so I needed to look at that when I considered it in the frame. Going that way into it gave me the opportunity to really consider how I was going to move forward with the rest of the picture, because I needed to get the shadow detail right as well. Have a look at this picture first, see what you think, and I'm going to go into how I pick those settings in the next image that I produce. I've set the camera up at my second composition, fairly low angle, and I've got some rocks on the left and right hand side acting as a lead in to a rock in the middle where there's water pouring over and breaking both sides of the rock. Now, as I said when I took the previous photograph, I was going to explain to you how I actually decide on what shutter speed I want to use. It's all about getting the right speed for the moving water. There's quite a lot of water moving down this river today, so we're not going to have to use a tremendously slow shutter speed to get a nice creamy sort of blurred effect. What I'm going to show you now is the way in which you can decide for yourselves what it is exactly that you want to use and how you're going to take your images when you set up in the field. So the first thing is I always shoot in manual. Manual exposure, that is. If you want to see how I focus and how I use my focusing, then maybe you want to watch one of my other videos on how I set my camera up for focusing. And I have actually got a full video series on getting correct exposure as well, so you might want to look at that if any of these terms make no sense whatsoever for you. So I've set my camera up first of all to take my first exposure, f11 at half a second. And what we're going to do is we're going to take that picture first. So that's that first picture taken. Now what I need to do is actually decide what shutter speed I want to use and how much blur I want in that water. And I'm going to do that by bracketing the shutter speed. Every time I change the exposure, I need to alter the aperture to keep the exposure correct. So I'm going to take a series of photographs. The first one is half a second. So I've taken my final exposure at 4 seconds at f14. Now I've had to adjust quite a few camera settings to enable me to correct the exposure each time that I move my shutter speed. But let's have a look at these pictures first on the raw files and decide what shutter speed I'm going to use. When we've done that, I'll explain how we make sure we get the correct exposure. Actually decided that the image I like the most is half a second at f11. Now getting the exposure right is the difficult part, because I've already set myself really that I'm going to have to be shooting at half a second. Now I can change the aperture, I can vary it slightly, and that'll give me a number of different options, but that depends on the depth of field that I need. For this particular image I think we're going to need f11, but I can also try f8 as well. And the reason I would want to do that is because there's only one other control left I can move, and that's the ISO sensitivity. So when I took this image, the ISO was actually set at ISO 800. Now my camera is fairly good, it gives me a reasonably good noise ratio, I don't get a lot of noise in it, and to be honest at ISO 800 I'm going to be reasonably happy with the image. But if any of you know anything about digital noise, you're also going to know that you're going to use the most sensitive settings on your sensor give you the highest amount of noise in the image. So we should always try and keep it as low as we can and work towards ISO 100. So I'm going to take a series of images though, because I'm a little bit concerned that f8 isn't going to give me the depth of field that I need. So I'm going to be working at taking some at f11 as well. So I'm going to take those pictures, then I'm going to show you that final image that I decide to settle on at the end. But don't go yet, because there's another photograph coming up. There's another opportunity to show you another way to control exposure. Well, not really control exposure, but another way to modify the light. And that's where things can get really exciting. I'm on my way to take the third picture, and I want to show you something. I want to show you another way of controlling the exposure, controlling what we can do with our images. Because we can't control the light, can we? But there is one thing we can do. We can modify the light. And the next thing I want to talk about is exactly that. It's modifying the light. I want you to start thinking about, whilst I get down to where I'm going and taking this photograph, about filters. Because when you start thinking about filters as light modifiers, they start to make a little bit more sense. Okay, third photograph. I'm going to get the camera set up when I get to the location, and we'll talk through modifying the light. Okay, so we were talking about using filters and using them as light modifiers. Now I've set the camera up and I've put a number of filters in. In fact, I've put a filter on that I don't actually use very often at all. I didn't even plan on using it today, but it's actually working really, really well. So you've got kind of a bonus here. I don't use a lot of filters in my landscape photography. I use neutral density filters and a polarizing filter. And I think I use these filters more than anything else when I'm in woodland and shooting water. And the reason for that is because quite often I want to modify the light which is falling on the sensor. So we don't have to settle for what the sun's delivering. We can do something about it a little bit different. The composition that I've set up, and I'm going to shoot a bit of viewfinder video for you, so bear with me whilst I'm sorting that out as well. So the picture that I've got in front of us at the moment is really quite bright. There's a lot of reflections on it, and it's not that ideal, and at the moment it's a bit overexposed, but I want to show you what the impact of having the filters does. So the first one I've put on is a polarizing filter, and a polarizing filter in this situation is great for killing the reflections on the surface of the water. So it makes things stand out a little bit. It deepens the greens and the colours as well, but what I really like is how it takes that sheen off the surface of the water. And quite often it's those reflections on the water and those real bright highlights that we're not able to control. So just see what happens when I turn this filter around. Look. Can you see how the surface of the water is modified? So we've gone from having really bright highlights, and when we turn that around a bit, it just kills those reflections and gets us into a good position. The other thing I've got here, like I say, I don't normally use these filters anymore because I do it inside of Photoshop, but it's working well here, is to control the range of light in the image. What do I mean by that? Well, in this case we've got a very bright background and waterfall itself and a very dark foreground. So I've actually put on a 0.6 ND neutral graduated filter. So if I just slide that in position whilst we've got the video running, eventually you'll start to see the top half of the image getting darker. There you go. See how different that is already? And that's allowing us to take some of that brightness off the top of the image. So all I've got to do now is go through exactly the same situation as I did before in selecting the correct shutter speed that I want and the correct exposure, now that I've modified the light that I've got in the scene. I'm not going to run through that again because you can always go back and watch the video again if you want to, but I'm going to set my shutter speed to where I want it, then I'm going to set my aperture. So I'm going to take that picture now and show you the finished result. There's one final tip, and that is that when you put your camera away, always reset it to ISO 100, 1/25th of a second, f8 or something similar. That's my standard shooting conditions. It just means that when I've been doing this sort of photography and messing about with the settings, I don't take the camera out the bag and accidentally use the wrong settings for my next photograph. Anyway, I've enjoyed today. I've enjoyed taking these images. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Just want to say bye for now. Get out there, enjoy your own photography, and I'll see you next time.